Hello, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the type of research that we do in prematurity. Our lab is a translational AI ML lab that works on a broad range of clinical indications. And we use a broad range of different data types, including single-cell immunologic profiling, various other omics assays, wearable devices, and electronic health records. I'm going to primarily focus on prematurity because it is the single largest cause of death in children under 5 years of age, both in low-income and in high-income settings. Beyond prematurity itself, what happens during pregnancy has important implications for life well into adulthood. For example, it has been shown now that cardiovascular health of an adult depends on what happens during pregnancy, especially with preeclampsia. Similarly, there have been indications between overall fitness, there have been associations between overall fitness levels and prematurity. So it's very important to understand what happens during pregnancy and shortly after birth to optimize our health well into adulthood. For our big picture thinking, we are thinking about modeling all types of data sets that are associated with a pregnant woman, including both structured and unstructured data, to build holistic models that can simultaneously predict various morbidities both in the mother and in the child. I'm going to show you 3 specific projects. First, we'll go over our immunologic studies. Then we'll talk about how social determinants of health can affect biology. And finally, we'll talk about a new taxonomy for prematurity itself. For our immunological studies, we know that the immune system is striking a balance during pregnancy between immune tolerance and pathogen defense. Our goal was to understand how various cell types during pregnancy change, with the hope of using that as a reference to detect abnormal immune trajectories. In our first study, we had 18 healthy normal pregnancies that were enrolled in the first trimester. We had a blood sample drawn at each trimester, 1 blood sample postpartum. All of these samples were processed using CyTOF, which is a next generation flow cytometer, with the hope of building a normal trajectory for pregnancy. The dataset included all of these cell types that we manually identified in the dataset. Each dot represents 1 cell type. 2 dots that are closer to each other represent 2 cell types that are correlated across all time points, all patients. This is the unstimulated data measuring these functional markers in these cell types. This is LPS, an interleukin cocktail, and an interferon alpha cocktail. This shows the modular structure of the immune system. Various cell types and signaling pathways go up and down together, of course. So we put all of these into a machine learning algorithm that takes all of that data and estimates gestational age. Turns out that we can easily build a model that tracks with gestational age, and after birth, it goes back to normal. Here is our validation cohort. It worked pretty well. We also had 3 preterm individuals who followed a completely different trajectory over time. The next step for us was to integrate that with data from other omics platforms. We had a cell-free RNA data set, a plasma proteomics data set, a metabolomics and data set, an immunome data set that you already heard about from CyTOF, microbiome analysis of 5 different body sites, and plasma and serum cytokines. Putting a large data set like this together in a machine learning algorithm is not an easy task to achieve. If you try to see what correlates with what, you end up with a correlation network like this. Not particularly helpful, so you have to go back to more systematic predictive modeling, for example, using ElasticNet. But if you apply ElasticNet to a large data set like this, it will end up mostly selecting cell-free RNA and microbiome features. The reason for that is that these are the 2 largest data sets that have tens of thousands of measurements per patient, and they're overwhelming the machine learning algorithm. You can go even beyond size. Adjusting for size is not enough. It turns out that the number of principal components that you need to account for 90% variance in these data sets is also different. These smaller data sets, even though they're small, they are measured carefully. And every feature is designed for a particular reason. So they end up having really good modularity, a lot of independent information content. So we spend a lot of time figuring out how to integrate these algorithms the right way so that it would allow us to pull information from all of them, have a higher level model that can predict the eventual outcomes that we are interested in. So using platforms like this, working with the Gates Foundation, we were able to predict preterm birth fairly accurately in the first trimester of pregnancy using data from 5 low and middle income countries in Southeast Asia and Africa. The model is looking at a steroid hormone biosynthesis pathway in urine, right next to it, the placental growth factor. That makes sense. And then if you keep going to the right, GCSF, PD-L1, IL-6, IL-1RA, the classic inflammatory module that is associated with preterm birth. This was published a couple of years ago. You can read about it in more details. Now we are in the process of expanding this to significantly larger cohorts. Next, we're going to switch gears and talk about how social determinants of health affect biological pathways. First example that I will show you is from our work on maternal stress. We administered a questionnaire measuring various aspects of stress in the first trimester of pregnancy in about 300 women. We were able to show that these stress questionnaires alone are significantly associated with preeclampsia and preterm birth. But more excitingly, when we took these models using a multitask neural network, we were able and predicted these outcomes, we were able to show that the immune system ends up being associated with this model independently. So this hopefully points to future directions that would allow us to use interventions that can modify stress levels to modulate the immune system in the right direction during pregnancy. In a different study, we have looked at 1,500 patients in whom we had access to data from wearable devices, from a smartwatch that measures physical activity and sleep. Using a sophisticated AI platform, we were able to build predictive models that can look at the data from physical activity and sleep and estimate the gestational age of a pregnancy. That in itself is quite exciting, but more importantly, we were able to show that patients who live here, patients whose gestational age appears to be higher than it actually is, meaning that they're less active and their sleep quality is low, so they look like someone who's really pregnant, end up being at higher than actual risk of preterm birth with an odds ratio of 1.33 and a really low p-value. And more excitingly, patients whose physical activity is really good and their sleep quality is poor, resulting in the model thinking that they are less pregnant than they actually are protected against preterm birth with a really low gestational age and a really strong p-value. So our goal after this is to connect sleep and physical activity with our electronic health records, pregnancy outcomes, placenta imaging, metabolomics, and proteomics in order to understand any possible causal effects between physical activity and sleep that would allow us to modify the immune system and regulate inflammation before birth. The third project that I will show you is focused on a new taxonomy for prematurity itself. Everything that I showed you so far defines prematurity as gestational age under 37 weeks. And then we are trying to use all of these various biological modalities to predict it. But why we were using 37 weeks and why gestational age was not clear to me as a non-physician. So we looked into it, and it turns out that this comes from historic studies looking at mortality rates several decades ago, mainly in Europe. And mortality rates themselves come from neonatal morbidities. Now we have modern data platforms. We don't have to go through this simple definition of gestational age. So we asked whether we can replace all of these with a neural network with many inputs and many outputs. I'm sure you can see the similarities between these two diagrams, except that 40 years ago, we didn't have access to this type of computing power. So we did that. We took a lot of large epidemiology level data sets and introduce them to that AI pipeline. I'll show you the results in a minute. But again, the current paradigm is that term birth is after 37, preterm birth is below 37, extreme preterm birth is below 28. But in reality, we have babies that are born late and are in trouble, and we have babies that are born early and are healthy at the end of the day. So we have to come up with a new taxonomy for that. First, we started with an epidemiology level clinical data set where we had linkages to neonatal morbidities in 11 million pregnancies in California. We put all of those through a deep learning pipeline, and we showed that we are able to predict these various morbidities fairly accurately. This is a model built in 1 million pregnancies, tested in 10 million pregnancies, and we are clearly doing far better than gestational age or traditional definitions of preterm birth, extreme preterm birth, or small for gestational age. But precision and recall is not good enough for us to be able to do any type of personalized precision medicine using these models, even though it is still far better than current practice. The first step to solve that for us was to bring in biological information by combining metabolites from dried blood spots collected in every pregnancy in California. With our model, we were able to resolve our precision and recall issue. This shows that, for example, we can predict necrotizing enterocolitis close to birth. This is a gut complication that is often diagnosed several months after birth, and by then the only recourse is a surgery with poor outcomes. But here we are showing that we can predict it immediately after birth. So interventions like delayed feeding or antibiotic use can be used to prevent that eventual surgery. The next step for us was to connect all of these to electronic health records. First, we built a linkage between the Children's Hospital's electronic health record at Stanford and the adult hospital. This gave us long-term information on the mothers, including procedures, diagnosis codes, lab values, and so on, as well as long-term information on the babies from the Children's Hospital, where we are tracking all of these various morbidities in them. So again, we have the mother's electronic health record, and at some point, the newborn's electronic health record starts. All of these can be fed into a deep learning pipeline. But before we do that, we need to deal with the longitudinal nature of the data. That is done using a long short-term memory neural network that works just like your brain. When you're reading a book, you don't memorize every single word of the book. You only memorize key concepts that then you bring to the next page, and you remember maybe for a while after you are done reading the book. The same thing happens here. Memorizing the entire electronic health record of a patient is not possible. That data set would be too big, but the LSTM does a pretty good job at carrying the critical concepts forward until an eventual prediction is made. Using this pipeline, we show that we can predict necrotizing enterocolitis at birth fairly accurately, but excitingly, we can even predict it before birth. Similarly, bronchopulmonary dysplasia is a lung complication that we can predict at birth, but importantly, we can also predict it before birth. Here is an example from one patient. A red check mark indicates a diagnosis that was made for this one patient, and a green cross means a disease that they ended up not getting. And as you can see, we got every diagnosis right. But more importantly, we almost got everything right 2 weeks before birth, before there even was a baby. We already knew what is going to happen to this baby. So that's quite exciting. When you look at what the model is considering, it's looking at insulin use in the mother, antihypertensive use, history of chemotherapy, even if it was several years before pregnancy, as well as a wide range of other factors, including the status of the immune system and even social determinants of health like incarceration, homelessness, tobacco use. If you compare this network across various morbidities, you start seeing differences. So these factors are being used non-uniformly depending on which morbidity needs to be predicted. If you look at the lab values alone, you will see, for example, that mothers with a stronger immune system, with higher levels of lymphocytes, neutrophils, and so on, are giving birth to babies that are protected across the board against various morbidities. Similarly, mothers with a higher albumin level as a surrogate for nutrition are giving birth to babies that have better protection against various outcomes, regardless of gestational age. All right, so I'm going to stop here. Apologies that I couldn't be there with you in person, hopefully next year. Thank you for listening, and please feel free to reach out to me directly with any questions about our work on biology or AI, or even indications beyond preterm birth itself. With that, I would like to thank a large group of people in the lab, our alumni, various investigators in the Prematurity Research Center, including David Stevenson, Gary Shaw, and Carl Sylvester, our colleagues at the Gates Foundation and the MOMI Consortium, Martin Angst and Brice Goudelier, who have been my co-PIs for some of our biological works, as well as various funding agencies. Thank you very much.